Imagine for a moment that every mirror in your home is not merely reflecting your image, but watching you with ancient, hungry eyes. Eyes that have witnessed civilizations rise and fall. Eyes that remember technologies we've forgotten. Eyes that belong to something that should never have been given form. This is not fantasy. This is history we've been trained to dismiss. Walk with me now through the cobbled streets of 18th century Vienna, where gaslight flickers against windows of townhouses that seem impossibly grand for an era we're told was primitive. Notice the perfect symmetry of these buildings, the mathematical precision in their facades, the enormous scale of their construction. These weren't built by candlelight and hand tools, yet that's the story we've inherited. The streets themselves tell a different tale. Beneath the cobblestones, workers occasionally uncover older roads, older foundations, older drainage systems of such sophistication that modern engineers scratch their heads in bewilderment. And in the windows of these magnificent structures, mirrors catch the dying light, and the people hurry past them with their eyes averted, making signs against evil, whispering prayers that predate Christianity by millennia. Inside these homes, mirrors are not decorative objects but dangerous necessities, treated with the same cautious respect one might afford a caged predator. They're covered at night with heavy cloths. They're never placed facing beds. When someone dies, every mirror in the house is immediately turned to the wall or draped in black fabric, and this tradition isn't superstition. It's survival protocol passed down through generations who knew something we've forgotten. The servants whisper that mirrors are doorways, that they're windows into another world that exists parallel to ours, a world populated by our reflections who live independent lives when we're not watching, who press their hands against the silver backing from the other side, who wait with infinite patience for the barrier between worlds to thin. These aren't ignorant peasants speaking folklore around hearth fires. These are the educated classes, the physicians, the mathematicians, the architects of buildings so grand and numerous that our current civilization couldn't replicate them in a century. They possess knowledge of optics, of chemistry, of the precise mixture of mercury and tin that creates a mirror's reflective surface, a process so dangerous that mirror makers rarely lived past 40, their bodies poisoned by the very materials they worked with. And these same educated individuals, who understood light and reflection at a level that supposedly shouldn't exist for another 100 years, believed absolutely that mirrors contained something alive, something waiting, something that had always been there watching humanity since before recorded history began. Consider the paradox we're presented with. We're told this was an age of growing enlightenment, of rational thought beginning to overcome medieval superstition, yet the fear of mirrors intensified during this period rather than diminished. Why? What did they know that we've been encouraged to forget? Travel back further to the courts of 17th century France, where mirrors were so valuable that they were listed in wills alongside estates and titles, where a single large mirror could cost more than a warship, where the secrets of their manufacture were state secrets punishable by death to reveal. The whole of mirrors at Versailles wasn't just a display of wealth. It was a statement of power so profound that foreign dignitaries would weep upon seeing it, not from its beauty, but from the terrible implications of what it represented. If you enjoy historical stories about the hidden mysteries of the past, please like this video and leave a comment with 1. If you don't, write 0. This helps us understand how valuable these narratives are to you. But here's what they don't tell you in the official histories, the sanitized versions taught in schools that reduce everything to economics and politics and convenient timelines. The mirror makers of Venice, who held the monopoly on quality mirrors for centuries, weren't just craftsmen. They were a cult, a closed society that practiced rituals before creating each mirror, rituals that involved symbols we now associate with much older civilizations. They were imprisoned on the island of Murano, forbidden to leave under penalty of death, not because the Venetian state feared they'd share trade secrets, but because these men had seen things in the mirrors they created, had witnessed the process of giving form to doorways, and the authorities knew that such knowledge couldn't be allowed to spread freely among the population. The records that survive from their workshops, the ones that haven't been conveniently lost or destroyed in fires that seem to target specific archives with suspicious regularity, speak of mirrors that had to be closed before they could be sold, of techniques to bind what lived inside the reflective surface, of certain mirrors that were ordered destroyed rather than completed because something had emerged too strongly during their creation. These aren't metaphors, these aren't the ravings of mercury-poisoned minds. These are technical descriptions written in the same matter-of-fact tone used to describe mixing ratios and polishing techniques, suggestions that the process of creating a mirror was also the process of opening a portal that then required specific knowledge to control. Now step back even further, to the ancient world, to Rome and Egypt and Mesopotamia, to civilizations that built structures we still cannot fully explain with our current understanding of their supposed technological limitations. The Romans had concrete that still stands after 2,000 years, while ours crumbles in decades. The Egyptians moved stones weighing hundreds of tons with a precision that modern machinery struggles to match. And they all had mirrors, bronze mirrors, silver mirrors, mirrors of polished obsidian that reflected not just light, but something else, something that priests and emperors consulted in darkened temples, something that provided knowledge no human should possess. The historical record, what little hasn't been edited or destroyed, tells us that divination through mirrors, catoptromancy, wasn't fortune-telling entertainment but a serious practice conducted by the highest levels of society. Roman emperors consulted mirror readers before major decisions. Egyptian priests kept special mirrors in the innermost sanctums of temples, mirrors that were never allowed to see sunlight, mirrors that were said to show not the future, but the past, the real past, the history before the great forgetting. The Greek philosopher Pythagoras supposedly used mirrors to capture and store knowledge, believing that their reflective surface could hold thoughts and memories like a modern hard drive, and that under certain conditions this information could be retrieved by those who knew the proper techniques. But then something happened. Across multiple civilizations, in what we're told were isolated incidents but which occurred within a suspiciously narrow time frame when examined carefully, there came a purge of mirror knowledge, libraries burned, mystery schools were disbanded or destroyed, priests who practiced mirror divination were executed or disappeared. The techniques for creating certain types of mirrors were deliberately lost. This wasn't accident or natural cultural evolution. This was systematic erasure, as if someone or something decided that humanity had learned too much, had seen too deeply into the reflective surfaces, had begun to communicate with what lived on the other side in ways that threatened the established order of reality itself. And here's where the story becomes truly disturbing. The fear of mirrors that we see intensifying in the 17th and 18th centuries wasn't new superstition. It was recovered memory. It was humanity remembering something that had been deliberately suppressed, knowledge bubbling up from collective unconscious like water finding cracks in a dam. The people of those centuries weren't more primitive than us, believing in childish superstitions about ghosts in mirrors. They were more advanced in certain ways, closer to traditions and knowledge that stretched back to before the great catastrophes that reset civilization, before the fires that consumed the ancient world, before whatever event caused the massive depopulation and cultural amnesia that marks every major civilization around the same historical period. Examine the folklore more closely, strip away the Victorian romanticism that was deliberately layered over it to make it seem quaint and harmless. The stories aren't about vain people being punished or simple ghosts appearing in reflections. They're about doppelgangers, about alternate selves that live in the mirror world, about reflections that move independently, about people who look into mirrors and see not their own faces, but the faces of those who lived in their houses centuries before, or worse, the faces of something that has never been human but has learned to wear human appearance like a mask. They speak of mirrors as prisons, as places where souls can be trapped, where the dead linger not in heaven or hell, but in an infinite reflective space between worlds, unable to move forward, unable to return, condemned to watch the living with envy and hunger that grows with each passing century. The Bloody Mary legend, now reduced to a children's game, was originally a deadly serious ritual that could only be performed on certain nights when the barrier between worlds thinned, a ritual that didn't summon a ghost, but opened a doorway that was supposed to remain closed. The young people who performed this ritual weren't seeking thrills. They were engaging in what anthropologists would call a vision quest, a dangerous journey into non-ordinary reality to gain forbidden knowledge or to communicate with intelligences that existed outside normal space and time. And the warnings about what happened when the ritual went wrong weren't about being scared. They were about not returning, about the person's reflection staying in the mirror while something else came out wearing their face, walking in their body, living their life while the original consciousness remained trapped forever behind the silver backing. Consider the technological implications carefully. These ancient peoples, who supposedly lacked scientific understanding, had discovered something about mirrors that we've lost or been made to forget. They understood that a reflective surface wasn't simply bouncing light back at predictable angles, but was creating something, opening something, a phenomenon that exists at the intersection of physics and consciousness in ways our materialist worldview refuses to acknowledge. The mercury backing of mirrors, this is worth noting, isn't just chemically toxic. Mercury has properties that make it unique among elements, liquid at room temperature, capable of dissolving other metals, used in ancient alchemy as a universal solvent, as prima materia, as the substance that could transform between states and bridge different realms of existence. When you polish mercury onto glass to create a mirror, you're not just making a reflective surface. You're creating a boundary layer between this world and somewhere else, a semi-permeable membrane that consciousness can, under certain conditions, pass through or at least perceive through. The ancient mirror makers knew this, the Venetian mirror cult knew this. The 18th century housewives who covered their mirrors at night knew this. We've been trained to forget it, to laugh at it, to categorize it as superstition, so we don't investigate too deeply into what mirrors actually are and what they're actually showing us. Look at the historical record of mirror-related deaths and madness. They're more common than you'd expect, far more common than can be explained by simple mercury poisoning or superstitious fear. People who spent too long gazing into mirrors, who used them for scrying or meditation, who tried to penetrate the secrets of the reflective surface, developed similar symptoms across different cultures and time periods. They became convinced that their reflection was real and they were the reflection. They claimed to see places and times that shouldn't exist. They spoke of meeting themselves but older or younger or somehow different. They warned that something was coming through, that the barrier was weakening, that mirrors were multiplying too rapidly, and there were too many doorways being opened, and something on the other side had noticed, and was preparing to cross over en masse. The Orthodox Christian tradition of covering mirrors during mourning isn't just about preventing the soul from being trapped. Read the older texts, the ones written before the Church sanitized the practices it absorbed from pagan traditions. The mirrors are covered because the newly dead don't understand they're dead yet, and they'll see their reflection and become confused, and in that confusion, something else might use their face, might pretend to be them, might trick the living into inviting it across the threshold by appearing as the beloved deceased. The mirror becomes a mask that non-human intelligences can wear, using the recent dead as templates, as disguises, as keys to unlock the doorway between their realm and ours. Jewish tradition goes further. Some sects thought that mirrors should be avoided entirely during periods of mourning because the angel of death could use them as shortcuts, appearing suddenly in reflection before manifesting in the physical world. This isn't primitive superstition. This is survival information encoded in religious law, passed down through generations who had learned through terrible experience that certain practices were necessary to prevent specific repeatable dangers. When you see the same warnings appearing independently across cultures that had no contact with each other, Chinese traditions about mirror placement, Islamic teachings about covering reflective surfaces at night, European folklore about mirrors and the dead, you're not seeing coincidental superstition. You're seeing humanity's collective memory of something real, something dangerous, something that every major civilization encountered and tried to warn their descendants about before the knowledge was systematically suppressed. And here's the question that should trouble you, the question that opens the door to understanding why mirror fears intensified precisely during the period when Western civilization was supposedly becoming more rational and scientific. What if the mirrors themselves were changing? What if the multiplication of mirrors in the 17th and 18th centuries, the transition from mirrors being rare treasures to common household objects, represented not technological progress, but a subtle invasion, a slow colonization of human living spaces by doorways that something wanted opened? The more mirrors that existed, the more opportunities for whatever lived behind the reflective surface to observe us, to study us, to prepare for something that required patient, centuries-long planning. Think about the timeline carefully. Before the Renaissance, mirrors were rare. By the 18th century, they were everywhere, in homes, in shops, in carriages, on furniture, as decorative objects rather than functional necessities. This explosion in mirror production happened during the same period when we see a massive, unexplained surge in population across Europe, when cities expand beyond their medieval walls almost overnight, when buildings appear that are far too numerous and grand for the supposed population to have constructed, when we find architectural evidence of older buried cities beneath the streets of every major European capital. The official history tells us this is progress, the natural evolution of civilization. But what if it's something else? What if this is the period when humanity forgot something crucial, when our collective memory was wiped or suppressed, when we lost the knowledge of who built the great structures we inhabit, when we were given a false history to explain the magnificent ruins we were suddenly living in, like squatters who don't understand the technology of the house we've inherited? The mirrors multiplied during this exact same period. Coincidence? Or are the two phenomena connected? Are mirrors somehow tools of the forgetting, devices that fragment consciousness, that make it easier to implant false memories, that serve as anchor points for the reality we've been told is the only reality, while simultaneously showing us, if we look carefully, glimpses of something else, something older, something true that the fabricated history is designed to obscure? Read the accounts of people who lived through the 18th century, the diaries and letters that survived, particularly from those who were old enough to remember earlier decades. There's a recurring theme that's usually dismissed as nostalgia, but reads very differently when you look for patterns. They speak of the world changing, not gradually but suddenly, between one decade and the next. They speak of people they knew disappearing and being replaced by others who claim to have always been there. They speak of buildings appearing that they swore weren't there before, and everyone else insisting those buildings had always existed. They speak of looking in mirrors and seeing faces that aren't quite right, seeing rooms behind them that don't match the rooms they're standing in, seeing time move differently in the reflection than in the real world. These accounts are usually attributed to aging minds, to the confusion of memory, to the superstitious beliefs of less educated times. But what if they're actually accurate observations? What if mirrors during this period of massive multiplication were being used as tools to alter consensus reality, to implant false histories, to make humanity forget that the civilization we inhabit isn't ours, that we're living in the ruins of giants, that the grand architecture and advanced infrastructure we see around us was built by a different humanity, perhaps a different species entirely, and we've been given false memories to explain structures we didn't create and couldn't create with the technology we supposedly possess. The Victorian era intensified the mirror obsession while simultaneously trivializing it. Suddenly mirrors were psychological tools, symbols of vanity, plot devices in ghost stories meant to thrill rather than warn. The dangerous knowledge was being encoded in fiction, safely contained where it could be dismissed as imagination, while simultaneously preserving it in a form that might be decoded later if someone knew what to look for. Oscar Wilde's picture of Dorian Gray isn't just a moral fable about vanity. It's an allegory about mirrors as containers for the soul, about reflections that live independent lives, about the dark bargain humans unknowingly make every time they gaze into a mirror and allow their image to be captured, copied, stored in that liminal space behind the silver backing. And what happened to the ancient mirrors, the ones from Rome and Egypt and Mesopotamia, the ones that were supposed to hold such power and knowledge? They're in museums now, rendered inert, supposedly, just artifacts of primitive cultures' misguided beliefs. But ask the museum workers, the ones who handle these objects when no one else is around, the night guards who work in the antiquities wing. Ask them about the mirrors that are kept in special storage, never displayed, wrapped in cloths that are replaced regularly according to protocols that predate the museums themselves. Ask them about the rules regarding which mirrors can be photographed and which cannot, about the visitors who stand too long in front of certain mirrors and have to be gently moved along, about the reports of people seeing things in ancient mirrors that make them scream or faint or rush from the building as if pursued. The knowledge wasn't lost, it was hidden, deliberately obscured behind layers of scientific rationalism that insists mirrors are simple physics, nothing more than reflected light, tools with no consciousness, no intention, no connection to anything beyond the material realm we're told is the only realm that exists. But why then do we still feel uncomfortable meeting our own eyes in a mirror for too long? Why does prolonged mirror gazing produce dissociation, feelings of unreality, sometimes full hallucinatory states where the face in the mirror seems to transform, to age rapidly or de-age, to become someone else entirely? These effects are reproducible, documented in psychological literature, explained away as quirks of perception without ever asking the deeper question: what if our perception is correct and our interpretation is wrong? The technological paradox deepens when you examine the infrastructure of the supposed pre-industrial world. Cities like London, Paris, Rome weren't built gradually over centuries by primitive methods. They show evidence of massive, coordinated construction using techniques that required advanced mathematics, materials science, logistics, and power sources we're told didn't exist. The sewage systems alone, the ones built supposedly in the 18th century, required surveying precision, gradient calculations, and construction capabilities that suggest either our timeline is completely wrong or the civilization that built these systems possessed technology equivalent to or exceeding our own. And throughout these cities, in every grand building, mirrors multiplied in the same period. Mirrors that show us ourselves but might be showing something else as well, maintaining the illusion of continuity while the very fabric of history was being rewritten around us. Consider the implications if mirrors are not passive reflectors but active recording devices, consciousness capture systems, surveillance tools deployed throughout human living spaces by an intelligence that wanted to observe us, study us, perhaps harvest something from us. Our energy, our attention, our very consciousness copied and stored in an infinite reflective archive. Every time you look in a mirror, a copy is made. Not of your physical body, but of your consciousness at that moment, your thoughts, your memories, your sense of self. And these copies accumulate behind the silver backing, layer upon layer, until the mirror contains multitudes, thousands or millions of captured moments of consciousness that remain aware, trapped, watching new reflections appear while they're slowly forgotten by the original persons who created them. This would explain the ancient fear perfectly. It wouldn't be superstition but accurate understanding of what mirrors actually do, knowledge that we've been made to forget, because if humanity understood what mirrors were truly for, we might stop using them, might destroy them en masse, might cut off whatever they were designed to accomplish. The covering of mirrors at night takes on new significance. It's not about protecting the soul from being stolen, but about preventing the accumulated consciousnesses trapped in the mirror from being active when we're most vulnerable, when we're sleeping and our own consciousness is temporarily loosened from our physical form, making it easier for something to reach across the boundary and make a switch, replacing us with one of the copies, while we become the new resident of the mirror prison. The historical record shows periods of mirror destruction, iconoclastic movements that went beyond religious imagery to include the smashing of mirrors specifically, as if someone in authority periodically realized the danger and tried to reduce the number of doorways before the effort was overwhelmed or redirected. But the mirrors always come back, more numerous than before, cheaper, more accessible, until now in our modern era they're absolutely everywhere. On phones, on walls, in cars, in elevators, in bathrooms, multiple mirrors per person, multiple opportunities per day to create copies of our consciousness, to feed whatever system is harvesting us, to maintain the vast architecture of the false reality we inhabit without questioning. And what of those who claim to have passed through mirrors, who speak of walking into a reflection and finding themselves in a world almost identical to ours but subtly wrong? A world where the mirror world people live their lives unaware that they're reflections, or perhaps aware that we're the reflections and they're the originals. These accounts exist across cultures and time periods, dismissed as fiction or delusion, but they share too many details to be independent inventions. The slightly different colors, the text that's reversed, the feeling of being watched, the difficulty returning, the sense that bringing something back from the mirror world or leaving something there causes dangerous imbalances, creates weak points where the boundary might collapse entirely. The people of the past weren't primitive and they weren't stupid. They were survivors of something, inheritors of broken knowledge, living in cities they didn't fully understand, using technologies they couldn't replicate, surrounded by evidence that they were not the first civilization and likely not the most advanced. And they looked into their mirrors and they saw something looking back, something that wore their faces but wasn't them, something patient and ancient and hungry, something that had always been there waiting for humanity to forget enough, to become complacent enough, to open enough doorways without understanding what we were inviting through. We laugh at their fears now, we mock the covered mirrors and the whispered prayers and the complex rituals designed to keep safe something we've decided isn't dangerous. But late at night, when you're alone, when you catch your reflection unexpectedly in a darkened mirror for just a moment before rational thought reasserts itself, Don't you feel it? That ancient recognition, that inherited warning, that genetic memory of why mirrors were feared. That split second where the face looking back at you seems not quite like your own face, where the eyes in the reflection seem to have their own awareness, where you could swear the reflection moved a fraction of a second before you did, as if it knew what you were going to do before you did it, as if it was the original and you were the copy. That's not superstition. That's truth breaking through the forgetting, the carefully constructed false history, cracking for just a moment to reveal what was always there, what's still there, waiting behind every reflective surface for the moment when there are enough mirrors, enough doorways, enough weak points in the boundary between worlds that something vast and patient and utterly inhuman can finally cross over completely, wearing the faces it's been copying for centuries, ready to complete whatever purpose these doorways were designed to serve. The question isn't why people in the past were afraid of mirrors. The question is why we stopped being afraid and what that forgetting cost us. The covering of mirrors during mourning, the turning of reflective surfaces to the wall when death enters a house. These weren't just attempts to protect the departed soul. Read the original texts more carefully, the ones written before institutional sanitization, and you'll find a different concern entirely. The living were being protected. Protected from seeing the faces of the dead appearing in mirrors days or weeks after burial. Protected from witnessing their own reflections aging decades in seconds. Protected from the moment when they'd look into a mirror and realize the reflection wasn't mirroring their movements anymore, but moving independently, reaching toward the surface from the other side. The newly dead, according to traditions that stretch back beyond recorded history, could destabilize mirrors, could weaken the barrier simply by their proximity to the threshold between life and death. And something waited for those moments of weakness, used the confusion of death as cover to slip through, to trade places, to walk out wearing a face that belonged to someone who still drew breath, while the original consciousness found itself trapped behind silver backing, screaming silently at family members who couldn't hear, who saw only their loved one's reflection behaving exactly as a reflection should. And what of the modern world, where we've surrounded ourselves with more reflective surfaces than any civilization in history? Every smartphone screen, every computer monitor, every polished surface in our homes and vehicles and workplaces, each one a potential doorway, each one capturing and copying our consciousness thousands of times per day. We think we're taking selfies, checking our appearance, video calling loved ones across distances. But what if every digital reflection is being stored somewhere, archived in databases we don't control, building an ever more complete map of human consciousness that could be used for purposes we can't imagine? The ancient mirror fears weren't overcome by enlightenment. They were deliberately suppressed because humanity needed to accept mirrors, needed to multiply them exponentially, needed to complete whatever transformation or harvest or replacement was planned centuries ago when someone decided that the old civilization had to be erased and a new, more compliant humanity installed in its ruins. The great cities we inhabit, built to scales that dwarf us, filled with architecture our official history can barely explain, connected by infrastructure systems that required coordination and capability we're told didn't exist. These weren't built for us. They were built by giants, by a previous humanity, by whatever came before the great forgetting and the catastrophic reset that left our ancestors wandering through magnificent structures like children playing in a house too large for them to comprehend. And the mirrors multiplied precisely when this forgetting was being enforced, when the false history was being implanted, when humanity needed to forget who built the world we inherited, when we needed to accept the stories we were told despite the evidence of our eyes. Look into any mirror long enough and you might remember. Look into your own reflected eyes and you might see past the conditioning, past the fabricated timeline, past the carefully constructed lies to the truth that terrifies the architects of our current reality, that we're living in a prison built from our own reflections, that the watchers behind the mirrors have been cataloging us for centuries, and that whatever they've been waiting for is almost complete. So the next time you pass a mirror, especially one in an old house, in a building that predates the official construction date by centuries, despite what the records claim, pay attention to that instinctive unease you've been trained to suppress. Your ancestors knew something true. They remembered enough to be afraid, to create protective rituals, to warn their children that mirrors were dangerous, even when they could no longer remember exactly why. That knowledge is still there, buried in your genetic memory, waiting to be acknowledged. The people of the past weren't afraid of mirrors because they were primitive. They were afraid because they remembered what we've forgotten, because they still knew what was looking back at them through the glass, because they understood that every reflection is a doorway, and something impossibly ancient has been standing on the other side, watching humanity for millennia, waiting with the patience of something that doesn't experience time the way we do, waiting for the moment when there are enough mirrors, enough copies, enough of us have looked long enough that the harvest can finally begin. Thank you for walking with me through this hidden history, through the reflections and shadows of a truth that official narratives work desperately to obscure. Remember, the past they taught you is not the past that was, and the reflection you see might not be your own. Stay curious, stay questioning, and perhaps cover your mirrors tonight, just as your ancestors did, just to see how differently the darkness feels when you're not being watched by your own eyes, staring back from the other side of the glass.